I came across a profile of a man by the name of Max on a dating app.
So I met Hamish through a very good friend who had investments with him.
We actually met Hamish through our eldest granddaughter.
Hamish knew exactly how to get them to hand him the money. He promised them fantastic returns on a short-term investment.
He almost went, right, I can get you $1 million.
When Hamish found someone with access to money, he kept going back again and again until they were out.
He used to always say, your family, you know, I'm not going to let you end up with nothing.
Everybody that Hamish came across from his perspective was a potential target. They didn't realise that they were standing face to face with a potential psychopath.
Hamish McLaren was posing as a 41-year-old banker on a dating site, calling himself Max Tavita when Tracy swiped right. A year into the relationship, he suggested that Tracy could do better with her superannuation, her retirement savings. He thought she could take care of it herself, and he casually suggested he could offer his expert advice.
The discussion that we had was that he would manage the investments in line with all of the other things he was doing as part of his line of work. So I filled in all of that paperwork, and then what I did was I transferred my money out of my existing super fund. Max's name wasn't on anything, and the self-managed super fund was set up in my name. And to me, it all seemed 100% legitimate. It was my life savings, $317,000.
Hamish wanted other people's money, but at the same time, in this world, this romance con, he knew that Tracy had to be so convinced about it for such a long period of time that that'd be the only way that he could eventually access her funds. Because we have to remember that these weren't opportunistic or impulsive scans that he just decided to do off the cuff. These were things that he had pre-planned for a long time, months, years even. That means that there were lots and lots of separate opportunities where he could have stopped his behavior, where he could have actually had genuine remorse and regret, but he didn't.
Hamish met Peter and Lorraine through their granddaughter, Jane. He embedded himself in their lives and took $1.5 million of their money. That was their life savings and the compensation claim from Peter's workplace injury. He kept telling them that they were making incredible profits, but in reality, he was just finding new ways to bleed them dry.
He said, I'll meet you at the airport, you get the papers for you to sign. The next flight was ready to leave. I had 10 minutes before it was going. And he arrived, he bought me a milkshake and put all this paperwork in front of me. He says, it's all to do with investments. And he just flicked the corners up and I signed them. Then he left. So I didn't have time to see the papers.
Hamish set up a scheme where he was buying expensive cars using Peter's money. He was then driving them around, racking up expensive toll fines and parking tickets, all in Peter's name.
We got in the mail a bill for a car that went through a toll. And I rang him up and he said, oh, don't worry about that, I'll fix that up. I said, but it's in Peter's name. And he said, yeah, it's in Peter's name. Remember, we're buying cars and I'm selling them.
One of his investments, he'd buy the cars and sell them, but I was buying the cars and he was selling them.
Karen met Hamish through a friend who had investments with him. He helped her borrow $1 million to fix a hole in her roof. But within days, that money had left her account. And within months, The mortgage repayments that he was helping her with had stopped, and she was having trouble getting a hold of him.
I rang him incessantly, every day, all day, and I even rang his niece that I'd been introduced to in London, and she said, please don't call me again, I don't know where he is. Just felt sick to my stomach, especially when it was getting towards loan repayment day. I had shingles, my hair fell out, I had alopecia. I was miserable, totally miserable.
Karen got word through a good friend, Henry, that things were much worse than she thought.
And then Henry had a really good friend who did work for Goldman Sachs in London, and this is one of the things that made Henry believe that he wasn't who he said he was. This friend went through the whole directory of Goldman Sachs globally, and he said they'd never heard of him.
Hamish didn't appear to have any real compassion. There was nothing there that would stop him from taking your money. You know, your personal circumstances didn't mean anything to him. For him, it was just another mark. It was another person that he could steal money from.
Hamish had absolutely no scruples when it came to conning people. When he met Simon in London, Hamish immediately set about his charm offensive, befriending him. And, as he always does, Hamish told him a stack of very sad but very untrue stories about his past.
My first impression of Hamish, he's got a big smile, blue eyes, looks very healthy, a very clever, convincing, charming, intelligent guy. I found that time really interesting, and I really liked the guy, and I thought there was a future friendship developing, you know. Hamish explained to me that he became an orphan when his parents died in a light aircraft crash, and that he went on to work for large banks, investment banks.
For this con, Hamish was once again Hamish Maxwell. He presented himself as a genius mathematician who went to the prestigious university, MIT. He said he worked for Goldman Sachs, developing top-secret trading algorithms.
Very sort of dark and mysterious stuff. The whole thing just appeared to be amazing, but real. I'd never met anybody before that managed hundreds of millions of pounds for people like Goldman Sachs. I didn't have a set profile in my head of what somebody should look like, but he seemed eminently capable of doing it. And I started talking to my best pal, Steve, at the time.
The general gist of the conversation was that Simon had met this chap, very successful, billionaire, and that this chap was going to give him a sort of leg up, as it were. Yeah, I was very happy for him at the time.
During this period, my youngest son was having treatment. He had 3 operations already for his heart. I needed a 4th. It was a good 3 months before he could come out of hospital. And this was, as you can imagine, extremely stressful for the entire family.
Simon has a disabled son who needed open heart surgery at the time. Hamish knew that extra money would be a vital lifeline for Simon, so he preyed upon that.
The amount I invested with Hamish, if you can call it investment, was £50,000. The return on investment for the money that I'd put forward to Hamish was going to be about 30 to 40% earnings over the original window was 2 to 4 weeks.
This just tiny alarm bell rang, which made me think, this is too good to be true.
Steve decided to do some digging. He wanted to find some presence of Hamish in Australia, but he couldn't find any records of Hamish Maxwell. He did know that Hamish was a fitness fanatic who loved marathons, so he set about trawling through running databases in Australia and eventually found a photo of Hamish finishing a marathon in Sydney.
he rang me and said, I've found him, and his name's not Hamish Maxwell, it's Hamish McLaren, and that's where we start, Simon.
There was quite a lot of information about this bloke, where he'd been a very naughty boy in Australia.
Failed companies, bankruptcy files. The feeling, finding that information out is, oh dear, we have got a problem. We are dealing with a villain.
I think I went pretty cold, you know, where you just think, right, you know, I didn't want it to be true, but it is true. So we hatched a plan that, luckily for Simon, worked.
Simon and Steve had a plan to con the con artist and turn the tables on Hamish. Steve would tell Hamish that he knew of a number of wealthy individuals ready to invest. But before he could do that, Simon needed his £50,000 back. Steve pretended to represent these wealthy individuals.
All you're doing is relying on someone who's greedy and prepared to say anything and prepared to do anything to get hold of cash. So the carrot that he's got, you make him an offer of a much bigger carrot. And luckily, as I said, he took it.
The money came back. To finally get the money back was just the most incredible sense of relief that the battle was over. It had been won from our point of view. We put Hamish's hat on, and so we scammed a scammer. And that was, you know, the final full stop in that story.
When we think about what motivates somebody like Hamish, it cannot be overstated that it boils down to greed. I think that is the most important and simplest motivating driving factor for him. He just wants money. And he feels that the world owes him. He feels that he deserves things like other people's money.
When you don't suspect somebody of being a fraudster or trying to con you, when someone says to you, this is my name and this is where I live, you don't automatically think, well, hang on, let me double check that. I didn't suspect anything. You don't even question it. I met his brother-in-law, so his sister's husband, Chris, and I met a friend that he had grown up with. In one of those meetings, his friend called him Hambone. And I asked him afterwards, and I said, why did Matt call you Hambone? What's that? And quick as a flash, he said, oh, when I was a kid, I was really skinny and my legs were really skinny, and everyone said I needed to put some ham on the bone. I needed to put some fat on myself. He said, that's why he called me Hambone. Must have been shitting himself. But I think he had a level of confidence and arrogance that made him believe that he could get away with it. So it just kept going.
I found different names that had been paying him deposits and also receiving money from him. The trading company that Hamish was putting a lot of money into, that account had received millions of dollars. But he wasn't doing what he was telling all these victims he was doing and wasn't trading in the way that he was purporting he was. It was pretty much washing money. There was always a concern that he did have a pot of gold somewhere and was going to run away down the rainbow with it. So I had to make sure that I didn't let too many people know what I was doing. There was a degree of risk associated with that, obviously. One of the people I spoke to admitted that they knew Hamish, but there was nothing wrong, and hung up the phone, which at the time made me very nervous. I was concerned that I'd made the wrong move. But I guess you've got to kind of take risks.
It was getting to a stage where I'd be ringing him up and saying, are you going to put some money in? Always had an excuse, and it'd be, I'm waiting for somebody to put the money in or to change it over, or I'd just about be talking to him every day. I went and did shopping and didn't have the money in the account that it was supposed to be, couldn't pay for the groceries. So I rang him up and he said, oh, I'm sorry, Loz, I'll quickly put something over. So he quickly put some money in the bank so I could pay for the groceries. But then it just got worse and worse, and that we had everything maxed out and we just didn't have any money at the end. We did have our suspicions, but I was holding on with the hope that if we hung in there, that it was going to be real. We would get the money. It was always saying that money it will be, you wait, you'll have at least 10 million in June.
Hamish knew that if he could lay this scam out in the right way, he'd be able to make excuses as to why the money's not returned. To constantly delay and delay and delay so that victim would be just always held at bay, thinking that they don't want to take action against him because they don't want to rock the boat and possibly miss out on their pot of gold that's going to potentially come down the track.
The fact that when Lorraine was anxious and worried about the future, Hamish went out of his way to comfort her and reassure her, all the while knowing that he's in fact ripping her off in the background, really speaks to his humongous lack of empathy. This guy has no compassion at all. He doesn't care about the lives he's damaging. He is extremely deceitful and he is a conniving piece of work.
I reached out to a couple of the people that I'd seen in those bank statements. Some were just done completely with anything to do with Hamish. They couldn't talk about him. At least a quarter of the people ended up in tears on the phone. Some of them just hung up on me because they couldn't, like mid-conversation, because they couldn't handle going back through that level of trauma, I think. I think it's an understated part of fraud, that there is a financial loss, but there's an emotional toll. It is really tough to read the weekly text messages of, hey, I'm struggling, I need my money back, where's my money?
There was never enough to pay the loan, put food on the table and ran the car. I sold a few things, just scrimped. I'm very lucky. I have got some amazing friends, and when the money really dried up from Hamish, they knew I was in a real pickle. And so they not only helped me out, they bailed me out. It was pretty hard, you know, and having to tell my kids as well that I completely messed up. That was pretty tough. I thought I was a better judge of character. I'm angry that he duped me. I believed him. For a while there, I thought we were gonna, you know, have this amazing friendship and it would go on, until he started to lie and not pick up the phone, and yeah.
So at this time, Hamish, was married, living with Beck, mother of 3, and his teenage stepson, Jack. Jack was dating Jane. Jane was Peter and Lorraine's 16-year-old granddaughter. Over a long period of time, Hamish put a lot of work into earning Jane's trust. He would take her surfing, he would help her with her homework, he became something of a mentor to her.
I just said to her one day that, why don't you ask Hamish about doing what he does? So, you can make a lot of money doing that.
Hamish always had a great radar for what people wanted. And I think in Jane, he could clearly see someone who was really bright. She was a school captain. She was very ambitious. She wanted to be something other than a girl in a, sleepy surfing town north of Sydney. And he fed that throughout the relationship.
She came to me and she said, Hamish is talking about going overseas and going to Princeton, and he thinks that he can get me into Princeton. It was a great opportunity, and I just thought everything was just falling into place for Jane.
Of all the things we found out about Hamish, this was by far the most shocking. He managed to, I suppose, morph the relationship from a mentorship to actually become a sexual partner. We're talking about the relationship between a 51-year-old man and a 16-year-old girl. It was pretty clearly a predatory relationship.
I actually think that he was grooming her from about 15, 16 when I look back at it.
Hamish had been deliberately, carefully, secretly grooming Peter and Lorraine's 16-year-old granddaughter Jane over a series of months. One night when they were all together in Sydney, Lorraine saw an interaction between Hamish and Jane, and the penny suddenly dropped.
I just looked at him and I said, how long's this been going on? And he looked at me and he said, oh, I'm sorry, Lozzie. When he answered that, I just couldn't believe that that would happen. I just felt absolutely dumbfounded and numb.
Another cruel layer to all of this is that Hamish wasn't even particularly interested in Jane for Jane. He was using Jane to get access to her grandparents. So not only did this completely detonate Jane's life, it also led to the detonation of Peter and Lorraine's lives too.
It affected her a hell of a lot. She was beautiful, very intelligent, beautiful personality.
Good at sports, good at everything really, and she's just a mess now. Just his ego. He's going to win no matter what.
What he did to Jane was just despicable. He's a very cruel man. Very sick man, I think.
He seems to be sexually attracted to the 16-year-old girl. Meanwhile, he was lying to his own wife, Beck, and he was ripping off this young girl's grandparents. So this really shows that there's almost no boundary that he won't cross. There's no level of depravity that he won't stoop to. It's almost like he has no moral compass whatsoever.
When you actually think about it, already the power imbalance with that age gap of having a 50-year-old and a 16-year-old having a relationship like that. Like, it's very difficult, I think, for a 16-year-old to really comprehend what they're getting into. When you do that with a psychopath, it's just a million times worse because there is no sense of remorse or guilt. When you have a relationship with Hamish, he just moves on.
She felt very, very guilty, very guilty. I don't think she should have been guilty. It's him that should have been the one that should ask for forgiveness.
For Peter and Lorraine, realising that he had been having an abusive relationship with their granddaughter was horrifying. But he also had this enormous power over them. They couldn't cut him out of their life because to do so would be give up any hope of ever seeing any of their money ever again.
I think he has many of the characteristics of a narcissist, somebody that has narcissistic personality disorder. So they have an inflated sense of their own self and their own abilities. On top of that, a narcissist has a need for attention and for admiration. And then on top of all of these things, you have a sense of entitlement as well, that they want things from other people. Hamish wanted other people's money. He felt that the law didn't apply to him.
There was some threats. If I went to the police, I would bring the whole thing down. Everything will fall apart.
But one of the go-to threats that he had was, you know, if the police come and find me, I'll run away to some beach in some faraway island and you'll never find my money ever again.
My friend who introduced me to him said she was going to help the police because she was now very desperate. Then I spoke to Henry again. He said, you have to go to the police now. I'm surprised you haven't gone, 10 months ago.
I had 3 victims who were willing to provide statements initially and knew of other victims. The hardest part was convincing these other victims that this was fraud and there was no investment. With Karen, I think it was tough. If you've been chasing this guy for 3 years, why would you risk talking to the police? You know, there was some hesitation there to proceed. For me, it was making sure that I didn't lose these people back into his web of lies.
Towards the end, I was so desperate. I called Tom and said that I will now come in and give you my statement. Then Tom hinted that it's over. There's no money, that he's done. Right up until doing that, I hoped that I was wrong and that we would get the money, but...
We had done some covert surveillance on him, effectively a body wire on a witness. It was a successful strategy because we got to hear exactly who he said he was. The witness just kept asking questions about everything that he said, and the answers that he gave didn't make sense, and the ones that he said he had evidence for, the evidence didn't exist. So when you hear it on a recording, there's no arguing. It was very clear evidence of dishonest representation. So at this point, the priority for us was making sure we could arrest Hamish and keep him bail refused. Because if we made a move on him and he had the ability to flee, then he would flee. In the end, I had enough evidence of deception. It was all about speed then, because the longer I left him out in the world, the more he would just steal. As soon as I got to a point where I thought I could keep him in jail, I went and applied for the search warrant.
We'd been in Byron Bay for the weekend. I was up there doing a presentation for a conference, and he had said he'd come up, he'd go surfing in Byron for the weekend. I did my presentation, we met up with family, we met up with friends, and then I flew home on the Sunday night, and I think he drove home on the Monday. I think we spoke that night, said goodnight, went to bed, and the next morning I was up super early. It was school holidays, so I was ferrying kids to different activities, having to get into the city for work. And it got to about 4 o'clock and I hadn't heard from him.
What Tracy didn't know was that Tom and a team of New South Wales police officers had been watching Hamish's Bondi apartment for a few days. Now that he was back from Byron Bay, they were preparing to arrest him. So, when Hamish stepped outside, they swung into action.
When I got there, I told him exactly what he was being charged with and who it related to and how much, we were alleging he stole. And at that point, he got pretty quiet. I think he wasn't expecting that much to come on him that quick. He just went really quiet, almost like a vacant look in his eyes, and one little tear rolled down his face. I won't forget that because it's probably the only time I think you'll ever see any kind of emotion out of him.
The next morning, I still hadn't heard from Max. I called Bondi Police because I just wanted them to check. I just felt like something was wrong. Gave them all the information, Max Tavita, his birth date, his address. In the meantime, a girlfriend of mine had called me and said, you know, how are you? And I said, I haven't slept a wink. I'm worried about Max. Something's wrong. And she said, I've just seen something on the internet and I'm going to send you the link and you need to take a look at it and you need to call me straight back. My stomach just dropped. I called her straight back and I said, you know, my God, that's him. What's happened? I don't know. And at that point, there was no name, there was no details, there was just him being arrested. And I thought, God, that must be a mistake. Like, this is a mistake. I called back Bondi Police and they said the name of the person and their age that you said that lives at that address is not the person that lives at that address. And I said, yeah, it is. It's Max. And they said, no, it's not Max.
At Hamish's apartment, search warrants uncovered a huge amount of bank statements and fake documents. Police seized 2 laptops and 2 mobile phones full of damning messages from people desperate to get their money back from Hamish.
We offered him the chance to be interviewed and he refused. But I just said to him, you know, I've got a lot more people to look at here. And, you know, he said to me, these are all just people who've made bad business decisions. And I just said to him straight, I don't believe you, you're a liar, and I'm going to be spending the next good chunk of my time making sure that I get you for all I can.
Everything just spun out of control from that point in time, and I was frantic to get information. I had no idea. His brother-in-law, Chris, had texted me, Tracy, please call me back on this number urgently, Chris. And in brackets, he wrote, Hamish's brother-in-law. And I called him straight away. I said, Chris, who the fuck is Hamish? The moment I realised that Max Tavita was Hamish McLaren was when I was on the phone call to Tom.
I just pulled over on the side of the road, halfway between the police station and lunch, and called Tracy and had a conversation with her that I'd basically locked up her boyfriend, but he had a different name. She was pretty sure of what she was telling me, that the guy I'd arrested, his name was Max Tavita.
I couldn't make sense of any of it because suddenly I'm being told that it's not his name, it's not his age, he is not who he said he was, and that in fact he is a serious criminal. And that's when the world came crashing down.
I said to her, you know, have you given him any money? And she said, yeah, I have. And I think she asked me, is that money gone? And I said, probably. I remember thinking, I've just kind of ruined someone's entire world on a phone call.
I think I vomited. I hung up. I felt so physically ill, like a visceral reaction in my body. I was in shock.
To speaking to Tracy, there's a whole nother element to what I thought was just a fraudster. He's also willing to be in a relationship with someone to steal money, which is just another level on top of what was already a terrible person.
The betrayal was so deep. It was a betrayal on a financial level, of course, and I'd lost everything. But the emotional betrayal felt worse because I had trusted him. I loved him. It made me feel so disgusting that he was lying in a bed next to me, pretending to love me, and in his head, he is plotting to destroy me.
I was very, very, very happy when they caught him, when they got him, for sure. Yeah, it's a good day.
It was on the news, and that's how I found out. One of my granddaughters rang and she said, "Have you seen the news?" And I said, "No." She said, "Well, watch it, because Hamish has just been picked up. It's a scam." Yeah, I was gobsmacked and absolutely dumbfounded. On the 14th of July, we were meant to get the payment that Hamish was saying that we would get, and that was 10 million. Then, of course, on the 11th of July, he gets picked up.
The biggest challenge with fraud cases is proving whether or not it's a criminal offence, because there is always a lot of ambiguity, and that's why they succeed, because they create a shroud of ambiguity around them, which makes it difficult for you to get to the bottom of what's going on.
You're talking about a situation which can easily be explained away by the fact that these people did give Hamish their money willingly. They were deceived, but they did give it away willingly. Tom Zadrovic knew in taking on this case that he would need a mountain of very rock-solid, credible evidence to keep Hamish behind bars. After he was arrested, Hamish was refused bail and held in remand awaiting trial. And over the coming months, Tom went to work finding more victims to include in the case. Tom's hard work paid off. In the end, the charges were expanded to cover 15 victims and more than $7.5 million worth of stolen money. But remarkably, it seems that even being behind bars wasn't enough to deter Hamish from conning. There are allegations that he was ripping off some of his fellow prisoners.
He's a master manipulator, and he's in an environment where he's got access to a lot of people for a lot of time. He still manages to generate income for himself. There's no stopping him, really, I don't think.
He has become so adept at being able to con people that it's become normal for him, because that is really the only way that he has been making money for his entire career. So it's all he really knows. So it's not surprising that he's going to try and do it in prison.
He eventually pled guilty to fraud, multiple counts of fraud. It was good because I guess the victims didn't have to go to court, but it also saved every single thing he'd ever done being publicised on public record. So I think it was more for him than for anyone else.
I went along to the court because I wanted to make sure that he was going away. It was only at the hearing that I got to meet everyone properly, and then I realised how many people there were affected. Terribly sad to hear other people's stories, people who had literally lost everything.
When we did get to the sentence date, I was nervous because the first question someone asks you is, how long do you think they'll get? What do you think the outcome's going to be? The general ballpark that I'd given a lot of people conservatively was 3 years. I just said that was the kind of my benchmark, and as long as I get more than that, I've got to be happy.
You're still numb, sitting there listening to it all and thinking, well, is he going to go to jail or not go to jail?
Hamish requested to be video conferenced in that day, and the judge said no. And Hamish came up from below ground and sat in the little cage in the middle, scribbling notes, never looked up once. That was quite confronting, seeing him that day.
This was a really important moment for the victims to hear the full scope of Hamish's offending read out in court, and the judge was very clearly not going to be rushed. He took 2.5 hours to go through every case and every person's circumstances and provide in detail an account of what Hamish had done and what he'd taken from all these people and the really detrimental impact that it had had on their lives.
It was very quiet. We were all waiting on bated breath. When the judge read out the sentence, we were all, it was just, you could hear a pin drop.
The judge was running through the sequences and the victims and the sentences issued to each. As I was writing them down, I think one of the first ones was 3 years straight off the bat.
Mr. McLaren, will you stand while I pass sentence? In my opinion, you conducted yourself as if you would never be brought to account. You conducted yourself as that you would not have a judgment day. You were mistaken. That judgment day is today. For the 17 matters, I impose an aggregate sentence of 16 years imprisonment with 12 years non-parole.
At that point, you had a room full of people who he had hurt, whose lives he'd blown up. They didn't know what to do initially. There was just complete silence.
You can remove Mr. McLaren from the court.
It was massive. It's the largest sentence I'd ever had, and it was deserved. There is a number that I would think is too much.
I just remember feeling just immense relief that Hamish would be in jail and I didn't have to worry about him. I was relieved, exhausted, emotional, and I was just glad that it was done.
Yeah, amazing.
More than expected.
Yeah.
Yeah, more than we thought.
So Hamish, he's dealt a life sentence to all of the victims that were in court today. 16 years isn't long enough as far as I'm concerned, compared to what he's done to a lot of people.
Seeing Hamish go to prison for a long time was a big relief for his victims. But the $60 million question was, and still is, what happened to all that money? Many people are convinced that it's all gone, that he spent it in a lavish lifestyle with private jets and fast cars and big properties. But others are convinced that there's still plenty out there, hidden away overseas in some hard-to-reach place.
There's an allegation that at least $14 million is in an offshore account in the British Virgin Islands, and that he has moved money through a Singapore account and laundered money through that Singapore account. There's allegations of property ownership in Panama and in Mexico. And there's also an allegation of a boat worth $600,000 US. I believe there's a good chance that Hamish has assets overseas. I believe there's a good chance that somebody overseas is helping him to hide those assets. And I believe that there's a good chance that we can find those assets.
2 years after his court case, Hamish won an appeal to have his sentence reduced by 25% down to 12 years. He'll now be up for parole in 2026.
I think the longer he stays in there, the better. He can't harm anybody, because I don't believe he would change at all.
When I think about Hamish getting out of jail, I have major concerns. And my concerns are that he will just do this again. The guy doesn't know what else to do. He's done it his whole life. He's not going to be a barista, is he? He actually doesn't know what else to do. This will happen again.
He's a nasty, lying, cheating fiend. Without a doubt, I think he will try again. I think he'll reinvent himself. Another name. I think he'll have another go at it. I don't think he knows any other way to live. He's a thief.